Welcome to Talk South Asian to me. My name is Michelle.
And my name is Anusha. Tune in every Thursday at 5 p.m. Central and hear us react to each other's stories about mental health and growing up in different South Asian households.
And remember, this podcast is not therapy. Engage with what feels entertaining and resonates with you and leave what doesn't. All right. Are you ready for the topic reveal? We're on letter
I'm
Y.
ready. Why?
I know. Why? Why are we on Y already?
Why are we on Y? You're so cute.
So Y is yearning for connection.
Mm-hmm.
So to break it down a little bit more, I know we discussed discussing the importance of social connections, building relationships, and combating loneliness for mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you ready?
I'm ready for all of the research. Hit me.
This is a really good topic. Like when I was doing research into it, I was like, there's some good stuff out there and it's very important. Like social connectedness is it's a very important aspect of life. The human psychology and the human body, you know?
Yeah.
So I did some general research on social connection, loneliness, and a construct that I found constantly in multiple articles and through credible organizations was this construct, social connectedness. So the first article I'm going to talk about is a CDC article, and it's called "How Does Social Connectedness Affect Health?" So first, CDC defined this term, right? Social connectedness, this is a quote from this website in the article. It says, social connectedness is the degree to which people have and perceive a desired number, quality, and diversity of relationships that create a sense of belonging and being cared for, valued, and supported. So that's a little heavy, but just like simplify, right? Social connectedness equals like helping us create a sense of belonging and feeling cared for and valued and supported.
Yeah.
So research shows that social connectedness influences our minds, bodies, and behaviors. It's related to longer life, better health, and improved well-being. So it has lots of correlation with those positive health outcomes.
Yeah.
And then I read another article that was a flip side. So it was a CDC article and it talked about the health risks of social isolation and loneliness.
Oh,
so like the flip side, right? Like instead of social connectedness, they researched social isolation and loneliness. So social isolation is the lack of relationships with others and little to no social support or contact. It is associated with risk even if people don't feel lonely. So even if a person's not feeling lonely, social isolation is still related to health risks.
Interesting.
I thought that was interesting too.
It really is. It's not just your perception of if you feel connected, if you feel isolated, but if you are disconnected, period, whether or not you feel lonely,
right,
it's not good for your like mental well-being.
Right.
And maybe
sounds
physical
like social
well-being.
Yeah, like social connectedness really provides a lot of benefits that are really important for our health.
Regardless of how you internalize it. That's crazy.
Right. And how you perceive it. Yeah.
That's a cool tidbit.
And yeah, I didn't know this either when I was looking at it. I was like, interesting. So loneliness is feeling alone or disconnected from others. It is feeling like you do not have meaningful or close relationships or a sense of belonging. It reflects the difference between a person's actual and desired level of connection. This means that even with a person with a lot of friends can feel lonely, which I feel like we've talked about this before, is that loneliness doesn't equate the quantity of friends, right? Like it's related to the quality of like having those meaningful, close relationships that give you that sense of belonging. Right?
Yeah.
So some research for social isolation and loneliness, it's linked to increased risk for heart disease, type 2 diabetes, depression, anxiety, addiction, and there was like many other listed as well, but those were like the top ones that I extracted from this article. But it has direct links which is so interesting.
Yeah. The mental aspect of it, the anxiety, depression, those don't surprise me the least. Even the addiction. The I think you said, what is it? Something?
Heart disease,
Heart disease and type
type
2.
2
Yeah,
diabetes,
that's not quite surprising, but it's interesting.
right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wonder
Yeah,
why
I would,
those
yeah.
specifically, though. I wonder the
Mm-hmm.
science behind it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Or like what's the link, right? Maybe
Mm,
it's just a correlation. It might not be like a cause and effect,
mhm.
right? That
Maybe.
loneliness causes heart disease. It might just be related, but why
Yeah.
is that pattern there, right?
Yeah. That's so fascinating.
So,
Our bodies are very
yeah,
interesting.
they are mind, body, very intertwined.
Yeah.
So, this CDC article continues to talk about how to improve social connection. So, 5 ways to improve social connection. Number 1, establish and maintain social connection. So, devoting time and attention to others, making effort, creating, like, establishing regular contact with others.
Mm,
Number 2, consider the support you give, receive, and have available to you. So, like, reflecting on how you are giving support, how are you receiving it, and what's there for you.
mm,
Number 3, strengthen the quality of social connections, which is makes sense, right? If you have so
yeah.
many friends or social connections, it's hard to have that meaningful, like there's not room for that
Mm,
quality. So then
yeah.
really focusing on the quality over quantity of social
Mm,
connections. Number 4, address the barriers to social connection, right? Like if there's something that's coming in your way to make time for your social connections, what can you do to make time for them or make sure that you are giving effort to establish and maintain those social connections?
mm-hmm.
Um, and then number 5, talking with the healthcare provider about concerns like stress, loneliness, and social
Oh,
isolation.
yeah.
And I feel like these types of questions are being asked in screening. Like when I go for my annual physicals, like they're
Mm,
asking, like, do you feel like you feel lonely? Like I recently went for my annual visit, and they asked me about loneliness, and I was like, so
really?
when I read this, I was like, oh, like they're screening for this too.
Yeah. Interesting. I don't think I've been asked that before in a screening or written. Usually what they ask you is, have you been... Actually, wait, now that you say that, yeah, I think so.
Yeah, which is
Hmm.
cool. It's interesting. You don't think about
I
it, but it's a measure that they
It
assess.
is. Clearly,
Yeah.
because there is a connection to physical and
Hmm.
mental symptoms and, like,
Right.
diseases.
Right.
I've always thought it was in connection they ask for, like, as like a way to assess for depression, but that's interesting. It could also be
Right.
because they're assessing for some of these, like
Hmm.
the heart disease and type 2 diabetes.
Right.
Interesting.
Right. And then our favorite psychology today, right? I found an article. It's called The Brain Benefits of Social Connection. So, more like, why is
Ah,
social connection so important?
mhm.
This was recently published too in March 24, 2023 by Dr. Austin Perlmutter. I don't know if I said that right. But some key points from this article is that healthy social connections are increasingly linked to general health and brain health. Our time socializing may help keep our brains flexible and boost brain resilience, which
Mm,
is interesting, right?
yeah.
Some reasons for high levels of disconnection include social media, lack of local community, and a shift towards a me first mentality, which I
Hmm.
thought that was interesting, the wording,
I like that.
the balance.
Hmm.
We should consider prioritizing social connections as a daily brain health intervention.
Wow.
I know.
Hmm.
So I like the point in this article the author made about like how socializing is directly linked to like keeping our brain flexible and boosting our resilience, right? Keeping our brain
Hmm.
active and young in a way.
Yeah. That reminds me of our, in recent years, like, more desire, especially since like COVID happened and everything, the recent desires for people to be more virtual. And it
Hmm.
reminds me, like, we all want to be virtual. Not maybe all of us, but a good majority, a good chunk of us want to be
Yeah.
virtual more often than not. But
Hmm.
truly, like, this is a good reminder that just because that's what we want, maybe that's not what's best for us.
Right.
Maybe having
Right.
that social connection, despite the annoying traffic and getting stuck in it, maybe that's what we need for just our day to day wellness and health.
Yeah. And like the me first mentality, like immediately like ding ding ding, right? Like us
Yeah.
moving away from the people pleasing mentality. So it's
Yeah.
almost as if like that balance is important.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
not like the spectrum, right? In
Exactly.
order to maintain
Yeah.
positive social connections, like a little bit of being a people pleaser is okay, but also
Mm.
like the me first mentality is good too. Like you need to find it in between.
Yeah. That's a really good way to highlight exactly what we've been talking about often on this
Mhm.
podcast is, you know, being a people pleaser is really oriented towards our ability to be social beings. And that's not a bad
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
but we don't want to be overly one side or the other, because clearly there
Hmm.
are downsides of just always prioritizing yourself and always, putting you first. It's not a bad thing to
Right.
do that, but you have to do it with a balance.
Right.
Yeah, I
All
love
about
that.
the balance.
That's a great, like, other side of the coin example, with our topic today and why it's important to find a balance and not just stick to
Hmm.
all or nothings of this is right, this is wrong. No,
Right.
the balance.
Yep. Balance is important.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now I have an actual research article. Now we're going into like the South,
Ah,
we're going to go into the South Asian section of our episode, right? Like some research. So this is a research study. It's a cross-sectional
okay.
study. It's titled Loneliness and Mental Health Outcomes Among South Asian Older Adult Immigrants in the US.
Mm-hmm.
So the authors of this article and the researchers of this study looked at loneliness and how that's related to their mental health outcomes. And this is specifically looking at South Asian adults, immigrants that live in the
Mm-hmm.
US. And this study was conducted in 2021. So I'm just going to read a section from the results section.
Mm-hmm.
So there was 600. So this they did like a survey um, to gather data. So there were
Okay.
682 responses.
Wow.
Okay. And these participants, these responses, these South Asians, 16% of them were Caribbean origin, 10% were Pakistani, 9% were Bangladeshi, and 8% were Indian. Okay. So they have 682 South Asian adult immigrants that live in the US.
Uh-huh.
9.4% of them reported symptoms of mild or moderate depression. So 9.4% said they feel mild or moderate depression.
Mm-hmm.
And then about a third of the participants, so 29.9%, reported feeling lonely. A whole third
Mm-hmm.
of this
Wow.
population said that they felt lonely. And 39.1%, so more than a third, experienced any type of emotional distress. Okay. So when
Mm.
compared to those participants that rated like good like health, like good self-rated health or having poor or sorry, when compared to those with excellent or very good self-rated health,
Mm-hmm.
having fair, poor or terrible self-rated health was associated with a greater adjusted or greater chance of having depression. So
Mm.
which is understandable for us, right? Like if you
Yeah.
have poor or terrible self rated health, you might also feel depressed, right?
Mm.
Okay. And those who were experiencing emotional distress, they were also likely to be at a younger age, which is sad, and that
Mm-hmm.
they live alone.
Ah, that would
Mhm.
make sense.
So more than a
Less
third said they
interaction.
were distressed, right? Like 39.1%.
Mm.
So though that population is younger and they live alone, they're more likely to live
Wow.
alone and are younger.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like strictly observational. This is not research based, but I feel like every generation gets to feel more lonely and lonely and lonelier.
Mm, mm,
Not to mention, if they're living alone, maybe less chances of human interaction
yeah,
too.
yeah. So that was like a nitty-gritty like research
Mm.
article. I just kind of said a snippet of it, but the study goes into more in detail, like, talking about the discussion of the study and like how it's applicable for future research and other related research. But I have another article.
Okay.
This is written by Dr. Shebnam Berry Khan, who is a clinical psychologist and case manager, and she's director of PsychWorks Associates.
Mm.
And this article that she wrote is called The Cultural Experience of Loneliness: Why South Asians Need to Take Heed During the Coronavirus Pandemic.
Ah, okay.
So I thought this was a really interesting read too. The author, Dr. Barry Khan, goes into just the experience of the South Asian, and especially like it was more of like a context of like the Western world, but just
Mm.
with the pandemic and like the loneliness that can come stem from it, and how does
Yeah.
that specifically affect South Asians and that culture that they share. So some paragraph that I wanted to read that really stuck out to me from this article is that so this author was writing in like, I think it's second person, right? They also, Dr. Shebnam Berry Khan also identifies as South Asian. So we
Mhm.
are globally notorious for not taking up mental health support, likely engaging only at the point of crisis or beyond,
Mm.
right? We are thought to stigmatize emotional challenges where shame and a fear of others finding out are hindering factors.
Mm.
This is ironic since the nature of South Asian culture is collectivist, which we have said, right? Like, it's so
Mhm.
interesting. Like, even though it's a collective culture, when it comes to mental health, it's so individualistic.
Yeah.
This traditional perspective, typically held by the older generation, for some reason has had a slower attrition rate that even our younger generations feel the stigma more strongly than
Mm.
perhaps other non host cultures. This is a
Sure.
particular perpetuating issue because loneliness is one major weakness, is having someone you can share your inner more worries with someone. And
Mm.
it gets tricky, right? When you've been raised in a culture to keep it all inside and not have that someone to share
Mhm.
what's going on.
Yeah.
So I thought that was like a good way to like bring in the South Asian culture and view loneliness. Like it could be easy for someone to feel loneliness because already there are cultural aspects and factors that can perpetuate it or lead to a
Yeah.
person feeling lonely.
Yeah. Especially if they are maybe struggling with something in particular that they feel they can't
Right.
share,
Right.
despite the collectivist culture that
And the
she was
stigma
talking
too,
about.
right? Like, oh, I'll deal with it, or
Mm.
I'll just pray about it, or I'll just like, I don't need to talk
Mm.
to anyone about it. I'll just keep it inside.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it comes from somewhere. It's not just like we just know that, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
typically there are things that people say that continue that on.
Yeah. And then I really love that this author ended the article like specifically strategies for South Asians to combat loneliness. And I thought it was
Okay.
really interesting because it was very like narrow audience. It was geared towards South Asians, but it's so applicable and it's practical and it's doable. So these 7
Hmm.
strategies, I summarize them. The author goes into detail, but the first one is to develop and practice self-awareness,
Hmm.
right? um Practice self-compassion, kindness. This is something you've said too, right? Like how would you, if you were a friend listening to yourself, like how would you
Mm.
respond, right? So like
Yeah.
having that self-compassion and kindness. Normalizing conversations around emotional responses with your family. So like if you get feedback like, oh, you're just showing attitude, you're just being dramatic, that's why you're feeling like this.
Mm.
Like knowing, like being, like making sure that you dismiss that and normalize it, like make it a norm to talk about emotional response
Yeah.
or different emotions and mental health.
Hmm.
The fourth one is being aware of social media and how it may not always be real, right? The depictions of social
Hmm.
connections, and right, that can
Hmm.
also can lead to a person feeling lonely. They'll see like their friends and family like doing all things, and
Yeah.
you know that can cause, like, you've heard the term like FOMO, right? Like fear of missing out.
Mm.
So like that, I feel like that comes from social media a lot, where like when you're
Doesn't
watching
help.
other people, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Number 5 is finding a close friend who you can talk to about personal matters, or like a
Mm,
confidant, like someone
yeah.
that you consider close and you're comfortable in sharing what you're
Mm,
feeling. And then number 6 and 7 are more technical. Number 6 is psychotherapy, like seeking out alternative supports before diving into medication right away. So, like
mm,
psychotherapy, community based groups. And then lastly, like counselor, psychology support, like psychologist support.
hmm.
So
Yeah.
I thought it was a really
Those
good
are all pretty good
article.
tips.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it
I,
was specific.
yeah, definitely. And also general in the sense that still can be applicable to anybody.
Right. Right.
But I also really want to I mean, when you talked about the social media, I don't know what it is, but I've actually been getting a lot of clients talk about comparing themselves on social media.
Mm-hmm.
And it
Mm-hmm.
always takes me by surprise just because I don't know, maybe this is my experience specific. I don't know, but given most of my clients are typically around the same age and generation as I
Yeah.
am. And they talk about, like, for example, I had a client the other day who was talking about comparing herself to another friend that she had growing up that she follows, and like
Mm-hmm.
her seemingly perfect life on Instagram. And then another client today who was talking about how like social media really depicts like the best of when people are engaged, and like it's all
Mm-hmm.
like rainbows and roses.
Right.
And it was a lot of like breaking down with the clients, like, would you post the problems that you feel and face in your life on social media? And they're like, no. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, well, neither are they. Like, they're not actually having a perfect life. This is just the fun stuff, the highlight of their life that they're posting.
Right.
So this is a general PSA to everybody listening. Don't compare yourself to things that you see on social media, because that is not an
Mm-hmm.
accurate description or depiction of their life.
Yeah.
Whatever
But
you're
it's so
looking at, whatever you're
easy.
comparing yourself.
It's
Yeah,
so
because it's so
easy because
available.
yeah, and it's so available,
So
and
available.
our brains can trick us, right? Like we have to actively tell ourselves like this is not their whole life. But
Yeah.
if that's what, like, if you spend a lot of time, majority of your free time on social media, it's easy to be
It's
like,
hard to
oh, this
remember
is their
that.
life. Mm-hmm.
It's hard to remember
But
that.
you're right. It's
You
important
have
to
to
be
remember that.
aware. Yeah, it's important to be aware that social media is not real always,
Yeah.
you know.
It's just the best parts of us. And like that's okay, there's nothing
Mm-hmm.
wrong with it, but we just need to remember that it's just the best parts of us.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
if you want to be authentic on there, do it. There will definitely be people who would love to see that.
Yeah.
But even if you don't, just remember it's not all the pretty stuff that we see and the fun stuff that we get to see. We don't
Yeah.
know what went into that. We don't know what's happened right before that, right after that,
Right.
even.
Right. Right.
Okay, I'm getting off my soapbox. It's just something that has come up a lot lately. And it always breaks my heart when people, especially
Yeah.
around like relationships or lifestyle, and they talk about feeling behind. And it always breaks my heart. I'm like, you are definitely not behind by any means. What you're going
Mm.
through is not something that only you are going through. But that's the thing, we
Right.
focus with tools like social media, we talk about the best parts, and we never talk about, even in our collectivist cultures, the things that are icky or scary or
Right. Right.
not going well. Like for example, just taking like that client who's talking about her recent engagement and how she
Mm-hmm.
felt some doubts, and like normalizing that's actually not that abnormal. When people start planning for their wedding, there's too many cooks in the kitchen. Sometimes doubts
Right.
do creep in when problems
Yeah.
happen during that time. That doesn't mean that you're not still in it. That doesn't mean it's still not the right decision for you. But nobody talks about those doubts, right?
Mm.
Most of the time, people are like, oh, I'm engaged and I'm so in love and I'm so excited. Nobody talks about the struggles
Yeah.
sometimes of
Yeah.
planning and like the doubts that come up. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that could be a really harmful thing. It can breed isolation.
Right. Right.
We're not leaning on the support when it's there.
Right. It's
Okay,
an
I'm off my
important
soapbox.
topic. No, it's true. Like social media is related to, I feel like, a lot of different challenges, mental health challenges.
Yeah,
And
it really
this is
is.
definitely one of them, right? Feeling isolated. It's so interesting. It's like a paradox. Social media can
Mm-hmm.
like lead to people feeling lonely sometimes, in a way, in my opinion. Like if you start feeling like comparing yourself, like you said.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was like my research portion.
Mhm.
Do you have anything to add? Do you have any questions? Any
No, I feel like that
comments?
was. I mean, there were some things that I learned that were like super interesting, like the connection to the specific, the heart disease and the type 2
Mm-hmm.
diabetes. That was something I
I know. I
wasn't
was like,
aware
this is a
of. It's pretty
CDC
cool.
article, so I feel like
Yeah,
that's
that's
pretty
pretty cool.
credible.
That
Yeah.
is very credible.
Yeah.
But yeah, when we discussed this topic too, like even like I also immediately thought of three things. One, quality over quantity. Immediately, that's what I thought of.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the sense of like belongingness was the next thing that came up for me. And the last thing was these like buzzwords around like the more connected we are, the happier we are, the more supported we
Mm-hmm.
are, the more loved we are, the more fulfilled we are. Those are the kind of buzzwords that came
Mm-hmm.
up for me. And those are things that, reflected in your research. So nothing
Right.
really too surprising, but some interesting connections to physical health. That was pretty cool to
Yeah,
learn.
I know. I feel like there is like a lot of things I'm sure that we talk about have a lot of like somatic links. Like,
Yeah, definitely.
like symptoms
Mind
of the
and body
body.
are connected.
Yeah,
They're definitely connected.
right. Okay, you ready for my story?
I am ready for your story.
Mine's more like a reflection, like an
Okay.
observation of like the people around me and me. Like it's not like a story per se, but it's more of like a
Mhm.
reflection. Um, I
Okay, then
feel
penny for your
that.
thoughts.
Are you ready? Yeah, my
I'm
soapbox.
ready.
So I feel just like growing up in a South Asian household, being surrounded with South Asian family members, I feel that I've observed isolation, social isolation, lack of social connectedness, loneliness more with the women in my family.
Hmm.
And my thoughts behind that is like for women, right? We've talked about this before. People pleasing is positively reinforced in our culture, and then mental
Mm.
health is ignored, right? So reflecting on my family's history, this might be just like my own observation and it might not be true for everyone, but
Mm.
reflecting on my family's history, like my parents faced isolation and loneliness when they first immigrated to the US,
Sure.
right? And we've talked about this when you immigrate, right? You have to recreate your community that maybe you were born into initially. So it's a lot of
Mm.
energy, it's a lot of mental health or mental energy, physical energy to like move, like try to create
Mm.
your own community, create your own sense of belonging. And my parents shared stories with me how so they moved from abroad, like from their homeland to like the Northeast, New York. So they're like, this is like right before I born, around the time I was about to be born. My
Mm.
parents like shared stories that they had a really good friend group, and like every Friday they would take turns to like host potluck dinners, which was really
Oh.
cool. So, my parents like left their families behind, or like family members were like in other parts of the US, they weren't close,
Mm.
right? But they created this community to have that social connection. And
Yeah.
like it was a tradition, like every Friday, do dinners, hang out. And it's really funny. Like when they told me this, I was like, I cannot imagine you guys doing this. Because like I see them as my parents and they're
Yeah.
very different than what they're
Sure.
sharing, right? So so after I was born, right, they moved from New York to Texas and changed jobs. So they made
Mhm.
another transition, right, across the country. And
Yeah.
I think they faced some social isolation starting then. So,
Mm.
granted, when we moved to Texas, we did move closer to my dad's side of the family. But I
Mm.
feel like because of just past shared trauma and things like that, there wasn't really full, meaningful social connection all the time.
Mm.
And so I think in some cases, because of trauma or like, lack of trust, even with close family members and friends, social isolation can be intentional too, or like chosen, in my
Uh,
opinion, right? Like you're like, oh, I
yeah.
can't trust that person. So I'm not like, even if that person is my sibling, like I'm
Mm.
not going to talk to them and
Mhm.
share. Like I'm not going to talk to anyone. I don't trust anyone.
Mm.
And I think that was the case with my parents. And
Mm.
so, like, growing up, like, I witnessed this mindset. And, like, it's not like they completely isolate themselves. Like, we always were, like, with
Yeah.
our family members. Like, we would do birthday parties, traditions, Thanksgiving dinners, things like that. And, like, weddings. Like, we were still close, but they, like, I think there was, like, that lack of, like the quality, right?
Yeah.
Like, the sense of belonging. So, like, I would
Mm.
notice, like, it was very, not like surface level, like the connection that they shared with my dad's side of the family.
Mhm.
Whereas, like, I grew up with my cousins, so, like, we really have meaningful relationships. We do our, like, annual November, like, cousin sleepover that I, like, always look
Oh,
forward to.
love that.
So I know it's so fun. I'm like, we're grown adults now, but we still do it.
I
Even though I
love
can't hang
that.
anymore, I go to sleep early now.
Could you
Even though I'm
ever?
like, let's stay up and play games.
Oh
You're
gosh,
the
you're
first one to
adorable.
fall asleep on the couch.
Oh.
Um, but
Mhm.
in some ways, like, I started noticing this not like pretty like later on in life where there would be like an event and my parents would like be iffy about it. Like, oh, I don't know if I want to go. Like, we just saw them like yesterday or like last week. And my sister would be like,
Mm.
no, no, like we have to go. I want to hang out with the cousins again. Or I want to do this. So it's just like I
Mhm.
started noticing these trends where like there
Right.
wasn't that like shared sense of belonging. And I'm not saying it's been like that always. Like, it's evolving, it's
Yeah.
changing, like relationships change. And I think with me and my sister modeling that social connection with our cousins, like I think that's
Mm.
impacting like my parents. Like, they're more willing to like be having more meaningful
Mm.
conversations and things like that, but it's still a work in progress.
Yeah.
But I thought that was kind of like my observation in my household, where it was almost like it felt like it was chosen social isolation because there were people around us.
Mm.
Like, even with friends, like, my parents are very, very cautious with their friends. And I think it just has to do with
Ah.
their past trauma, like having that, like those trusting challenges and just
Mm.
like not having a hard time trusting others, even if it's like a close friend or a
Right.
close family member.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like my observation. And I think, and I've talked about this in a previous episode too, about like, I think it was like the Friends one where my mom or my dad would like, my mom especially, be like, you can't trust anyone. And like, this would be with
Mm.
friends too. So like, I started like getting this mentality pushed on me in some ways. And
Mm.
early on, I kind of adopted to too without realizing. And
Ah.
so I think that's why in some ways, like during my journey of, working towards more positive mental health, like that's something that have been struggling with and I'm working on, is like the trust and
Mm.
everything. But I
Mm.
think it stemmed from this, that she
Yeah.
chosen social isolation, that struggle to not be able to trust close ones in order to establish and maintain social
Mm.
connections.
Yeah.
But
Definitely.
one step at a time, I have my circle and I'm like working on having my people with me and being trusting and loving freely.
I hope so too. You deserve
Yeah,
that.
thanks.
Mm.
So that was a little tidbit, my reflection on my
Yeah.
family.
I love that. That's very insightful. And, you know, I feel like it's important too to differentiate, though, like loneliness and feeling alone. I feel like sometimes they get kind of
Mm-hmm.
crossed.
Mm-hmm.
And feeling alone is when you are literally alone
Right.
and you feel the distance. Feeling lonely is you can be literally surrounded by a bunch of people and feel lonely. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not about, again, like we were talking about earlier, right? It's not about the quantity, it's about the quality.
Right. Right.
Whereas feeling alone is there literally isn't like people around you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think loneliness is like the perception in a way, and then social isolation is like there's actually no
Exactly.
one there. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a perfect way to put it. It's a perception.
Yeah.
It's how you internally feel
Mm-hmm.
about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I almost wonder, like, in what you've observed, if maybe your family just chose to be alone more often than not because they didn't feel truly connected, truly
Yeah.
belonging in the community that was available.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
Or maybe like that's something that's generational, where
Mm,
like social connectedness wasn't modeled. It wasn't shown how to maintain and
mm,
establish and maintain social connections. Could be a
yeah,
generational thing too.
maybe. Hmm. But one thing's for sure, we are very social beings. We
I know,
definitely need it.
right? It's good for
Even though we
the
sometimes
body and
struggle.
mind. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. You want to hear my story?
Yes, I'm ready.
He. Okay. Well, I feel like my story, it's a pretty quick one. I feel like I can summarize it really quickly into three kind of segments early on, from what I remember, like super early, pre middle school, like maybe
Hmm.
elementary and early. The middle school, high school years, the formative teen
Hmm.
angsty years. And
Yeah.
then now. Um, when I was really, really young, I mean, I would say I've always been an introvert. I've learned how to be more extroverted, but I've always
Hmm.
been an introvert at heart.
Hmm.
And when I was really young, as you know, I'm also an only child. I was an introvert. I had pretty, traditional and safety oriented, risk averse parents. So I didn't like really hang out with friends outside of school,
Hmm.
things like that,
Hmm.
early on. And yet I never felt like lonely because I had a really deeply rooted sense of belongingness in my family. When we lived in India, and even when we moved here, despite moving here and like loneliness, I'm sure my parents had felt, I felt a really strong connection to my family regardless. And so I never
Hmm.
really noticed that loneliness um, personally until middle school and high school. A little bit
Hmm.
more, not quite too much still, but I did feel it a little bit more, as is typical, right? When you have teenagers,
Yeah.
hormones, angsty years, whatever we're talking
Yeah.
about, the ups and downs of friendship. And so I
Hmm.
feel like I've definitely had bouts of, feeling different, being an immigrant in the early years. Like we lived in neighborhoods where maybe the population wasn't as diverse.
Hmm.
And then sometimes we lived, rarely, but sometimes we lived in populations like Hebron, right? Carrollton had a
Yeah.
little bit more of a diverse population. So it was easier to feel a sense of belongingness. But before that, like it was a little bit harder.
Yeah.
So I feel like depending on where I was, who I was with, and like who I felt connected to, it's a pretty normal thing to go in and out of feeling lonely, right?
Yeah.
And then I guess now I've actually noticed that my sense of loneliness has increased. I mean, I still don't feel
Mm.
lonely often, but I certainly notice it more often. And that was a surprise to me. I was actually reflecting on this a while ago. And it was a really big surprise to me why all of a sudden I started feeling more loneliness. And like, obviously, you'll know the answer, I'm sure. It's because the root of my sense of belongingness as a kid was my
Hmm.
family, was my parents,
Right.
was my extended family, aunts and uncles, grandparents, things like that. But as you know, they've since moved back to India. And so I
Yeah.
realized
Yeah.
I didn't, I mean, honestly, like I was looking at it from the point of like, yeah, I'm grieving a family that I felt close to, but kind of like was a light bulb moment recently when I was like, it's deeper than that. I feel a
Hmm.
deeper sense of
Loss.
loneliness and like feeling it more often. It's not just those moments in between certain groups of friends in
Right.
transitions when you're like, oh, I feel belongingness to you. Oh, I've changed. I feel lonely. Oh, I feel belongingness to you and who I am now.
Right.
It's more than that. It's deeper than that, right? This is like the foundation of my community has
Hmm.
shifted and changed. And I know it seems a little bit silly-ish to be like, well, yes, they're far away. They're on a different continent, but that doesn't mean it changes our relationship.
Right.
But it's something that I feel like I've been contending with lately. I am more of like I need like physical distance, like the closeness,
Hmm.
the tangibleness I feel of like holding people. Physical
Yeah.
touch is part of my love language. Not being able to hold them, hug them, see them.
Yeah.
It's different than like
Yeah. It's a
I am not
change.
a call kind of
It's in a
person.
way
So,
like a symbolic loss. Like,
yeah, exactly. And so I feel like lately I've noticed that my loneliness and thoughts around loneliness and feeling loneliness have gone up. And it was kind of like a light bulb, like, oh yeah, duh, that's why I've been feeling it more often. Even though I have like maybe a good group of friends, even though I might have a good group of um like professional network, even though, I might have some family still here, the root of belongingness that I have felt for so long, that's shifted. And so it
It
brings up
did.
things.
And this
Yeah.
is like, these are your parents. These are the first people that
Mm-hmm.
helped you feel a sense of belonging in a way in this
Yeah.
world. Literally,
Yeah.
right? Like quite literally.
Yeah.
So like you're right. Like this is very deep. And the
Mm-hmm.
fact that there's a large physical distance between y'all now, right? Like they're not easily
Yeah.
accessible to you as much, right? There's a time
Mm-hmm.
difference. There's just so many other barriers,
Yeah.
right? When we
Exactly.
think on that, like it is a huge shift, like you said. It is a
Mm-hmm.
change.
Yeah, it
And
really
it's
is.
okay to
And
feel like what you've been feeling, right? Like I'm really, really sorry that it's been heavy on you.
inevitable, I suppose. But
Mm-hmm.
I have also been trying not to overindulge in wallowing,
Mm-hmm.
because then, obviously that pity party just kind of continues the
Yeah.
loneliness. And as we've talked about, anxiety, depression, self
Depression, yeah.
esteem, heart disease, there are things
Right.
associated with allowing oneself to continue to feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to a certain degree, like I was saying earlier, my personal observation is that each generation has just started feeling more loneliness,
Yeah.
because each generation goes further and further away from collectivist, community oriented, day to
Right.
day living.
Right.
Each generation, you tend to see more division in the day to day, at
Mm-hmm.
least.
Mm-hmm.
Even if
It's
you
so
are in a
interesting.
community, I couldn't tell you my neighbors. I have no idea who they
Yeah,
are.
same. Same.
But previous generations, it wasn't really like that. You would know your
Yeah.
neighbors, and
Yeah.
maybe you wouldn't necessarily feel a deep connection to them, but there's a sense of trust, safety, support, belongingness in that.
Right.
So I feel like, all of this really plays into a society where we just continually feel more and more isolated from one another and more lonely, despite having
Mm-hmm.
wonderful people in our lives, maybe. And like
Yeah.
it's one of the number one things I'm actually seeing a rise of in therapy too. Almost every single client at some point in our therapy will talk about feeling lonely.
Mm.
It is a rising problem. And I think
Yeah.
that we need to be more vigilant about creating intentional moments to connect with
Right.
people, to
Right.
live in and among people more than we
Yeah.
do already.
And combating loneliness is so crucial, not just for our mental health, but our physical health, our brain health. So it's so important to actively
Exactly.
work towards decreasing that feeling.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a delicate balance, I get it.
Mm-hmm.
We like our freedom. We have a taste of
Yeah.
it. We
Me
like our
first.
virtual spaces.
Yeah.
Got a taste of it. Me first, exactly. And that's all well, but clearly there's another side to that coin, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not pretty. So we need
Mm-hmm.
to be able to find a balance with it. We have to be able to
Absolutely.
be vulnerable and even maybe call up a friend or two and be like, I've been feeling lonely. Let's
Right.
get together.
Right. Right. Acknowledging it, being
Calling it
aware of
out.
it.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Because chances are, if we took a poll, I'm fairly certain the majority of people, if not more than the majority of people, like a really high percentage, are going to feel, at least in the past 3 months of their life at some point, having felt lonely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm like,
It's a problem.
the pandemic didn't help in that way either, in a way, right? Like
Yeah.
increase that distance and social isolation in
Mm-hmm.
a way.
Yeah. And it was so long, like the isolation from the pandemic, that I bet like it's instilled habits within all of us to
Mm-hmm.
distance ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't even imagine, all the kiddos that were born at that time and then
Mm-hmm.
not being able to socialize. I mean, that must have really done a number on their development too.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm sure there's active research studies happening right now about that. I'm sure.
I'm sure. I hope so.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that is my story, my musings, if you will.
No, thanks for sharing. Like, I know that's sharing things like that can make someone vulnerable. So like, thank you for putting yourself
Yeah.
out there and being real with me and with our
It
listeners.
was a vulnerable one. Okay, so having
Yeah.
said that, Mom, Dad, if you're listening, I love you. I don't resent you for leaving. Don't call
Oh,
me out later.
auntie and uncle, we love you. I
All
was,
right.
thinking on that actually, real quick.
Hmm.
Like, because of the shift now, are there
Hmm.
any like new traditions or routines that you've developed with your mom and dad to help
Hmm.
combat the feelings that loss of sense of belonging that you've been feeling? Like maybe
That
like
is a
virtual
very
traditions
interesting
or
idea.
like, oh, like every week on this time we're gonna talk. Like so you can like look forward to that, or like we're gonna
Yeah,
do
I
a
should.
virtual game thing, you know. I know
I
they're busy
really
people,
should.
so
Oh, yeah. They're busier than
but
me.
but it doesn't hurt to like ask for a little bit, like once a week or once every 2 weeks.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure they would, but I really do not like talking on the phone.
Mm,
And I have a really hard time. Like, I can miss somebody so freaking much, and I just won't pick up the phone and call them. It's
that's
like a
okay.
weird mental block. Like, I am
That's
definitely a
fair.
person, like, you gotta be here, I'm gonna show up.
Right,
But I
right.
can't call you. It's just like a weird mental block. And like my mom is the same way. So it's so frustrating because every time we do end up calling each other because it's been too long, we're like, why haven't you called me? Why aren't you talking to me?
Mm-hmm.
But
Oh,
we both do
yeah,
it. We're so both like
yeah.
so bad at this. But you know what? New year, new me. I'm gonna try. That'll be a
There you
resolution.
go.
I'm gonna attempt to connect more and
Other
figure out
ways.
whatever this weird deal is with
Yeah,
not calling people.
yeah, yeah.
But that's a good idea. I do like the idea of a virtual game night. You know, we did do it initially when my aunt and uncle, like my second parents, basically
Mm-hmm.
left with their kiddos.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first time we actually did like a international game night with all the
That's
cousins.
fun.
But it happened like once. It was chaos. Oh,
I
like
bet.
just utter chaos. Too many people talking over
Yeah,
one another. It was
yeah.
messy.
I can imagine.
But maybe it's a good idea. Thank you for that suggestion, babe. I'll
Of
look into it.
course, of course.
You can keep me honest if I
Yeah,
flake.
that's okay if you do. That's all this is about, right? Trying new things and seeing if they
Trying
work.
new
If they
things.
don't, that's okay.
Yes, exactly. Just gotta try, tweak,
Mm-hmm.
learn. If it doesn't, it doesn't.
There you go. Life lessons by Anusha.
Anusha and Michelle. I feel like I just
Yeah,
piggybacked
Anusha
on
and
you. I can't
Michelle.
take credit.
Okay, okay, we'll take care of it together. Talk South Asian to me.
Yes, I like that. Toxicization to be TM. Alrighty, shall I see us out?
Yes.
Okay. Well, as always, if our podcast has resonated with you and you'd like to share your story with us or ask any questions, you can reach us at talksouthasiantome@gmail, or you can find us on all the socials at the handle at talksouthasiantome. Until next time, bye!
Bye.